Welcome to our snow class. I started to go outside and get things set up where I could actually record with the snow coming down. But no, that wasn't going to work. But I did find another useful background prop since we're going to be talking about textual analysis in Chapter 5. I wanted to make sure you understood what I had in mind. Textual analysis, as you know, has to do with text and an analysis you do of those texts. And Abby, what do you have there? Abigail, this is my daughter, and she agreed to help, and we have a text. And yeah, this is exactly what we need to make sure we work on. In fact, for your assignment, if you didn't bring in the minimum, what is this? 1,400 pages? Yeah, about that. About 1,400 pages for your sample text. I need you to take on a little bit more of a challenge. Abby, go ahead and go finish reading your book there. Textual analysis. You may wonder what, in fact, we are up to. Not 1,400 pages, but if you were in an organization that was text intensive, where people relied on a great deal of documents for their communication, that was a major part of their culture, there may be that many pages of text. But don't fear, we're not going to spend time analyzing 1,400 pages of text. What I want to make sure happens is that you're able, before this session is over, to get a brief overview of some of the common things we need to keep in mind in textual analysis. So we're going to hit the highlights from the reading, but you'll also be able to see a couple of discussions that I want us to engage in. Okay, so one of the first discussions I'm going to have you engage in, and haven't decided yet, but you'll be able to look at the discussion board, where you talk about a recent experience in reading something relevant to a context of interest to you. So the idea is you can look at where you work, a family context, a school setting, wherever it may be, and just want you to engage in this warm-up activity, icebreaker activity. What did you read and why? What did you do with the information? What was your response to the information? And the point is for you to reflect on the pervasiveness of text in our lives. As we think about textual analysis, I want to make sure you're keeping it in the framework of what we're involved in this semester. We've already spent time talking about the value of culture and the cultural metaphor for organizational analysis. And so by now, most of you or all of you have written a particular proposal that clarifies that value for somebody else. Last week, we spent time on major cultural elements and used the analogy of the painter's palette, and that it's going to be from the various methods we use that you actually gain information on elements like heroes and values and communication rules. And so if you haven't gotten clear on each one of those elements by reading over and putting examples in, know that if you do that, you're getting a good jump start on the process itself. What we move to now and in the next few weeks is talking about multiple data collection methods. And here's all we have in mind with that. Have in mind the fact that all of us, as we've said, in our organizations, gather information, consciously, unconsciously, about how things are done in the organization, how we're supposed to do things in that organizational context. The intent here is to be more methodical and more intentional about making sure we use more than one means for understanding the organization. And so, in the process of gathering that data, in the future weeks, we'll talk more about interpretation and then finally application. Let's begin with an overview. We're going to talk about 4 major steps in the textual analysis process. We're going to talk about determining text and what text to select. And we'll make sure that by email within Blackboard and an assignment, you understand one of your first minor assignments related to textual analysis. We're going to talk about 3 different ways of analyzing text. And again, we're going to do our best to tie those back, not just to research and the ways that communication scholars analyze text, but I hope you can see that each one of these approaches gets at a reasonable and meaningful way that humans use to understand the text around them. And then we're going to talk about linking those results back to elements so you can get a clear understanding of how we're going to move from methods to elements. We'll talk a bit about triangulation, credibility, and ethics. And then The important step, the one that often is not followed through with, is what we do when we review our data again and making sure we're paying attention to questions that haven't been answered, that are contradictory and confusing. So textual analysis, like observations, textual analysis are just part of our sense making, our meaning management process used most every day. And so if you haven't engaged in that initial discussion where you reflect on the pervasiveness of text, do that. On any given day, beyond what you might expect, a barrage of emails that most of us spend time with, depending on the context you're looking at and the kind of organizations you spend your time with, you may spend a good half of your day, if not more, just dealing with text. So I want you to begin thinking about texts that are important in your organization. If somebody were to walk into your organization and they say, is there something that I could read that would give me a better sense of life in this organization? Or what are the kinds of things that people around here read on a regular basis or look at in terms of text? Those kind of questions can get at what's important, but then also to understand why people turn to them, the functions that they serve. Are they part of orientation? Are they part of making sense of a particular project or process? Begin to answer those two questions and you're well on your way to what we're after with textual analysis. Specifically then, your challenge is to determine a credible text. The intent was for you to come tonight with some text from the organization you're going to be studying, but you got to discern what makes it credible. When you think about credibility, you have to think in terms of authorship and who indeed reads it and who uses it. For example, there's a credible text that I have in my drawer in my office. That text is labeled differently in different organizations, is an employee handbook. Now, how often do I look at that text? I would say on average, perhaps once a year at most. Is it credible? Yes. It's been put together by our HR department with input from the colleges and deans, and it becomes an important handbook at crucial times. If, for example, there's a plagiarism issue, it's elements from that handbook that are going to provide some guidance on how to deal with situations. But the thing I would want to stress is while I've had you select just one text, in the actual process of doing a cultural analysis, I'd want you to think broader. What are those other texts out there, some that perhaps may be overlooked? So more than one artifact, both official and unofficial, so that you're not just looking at an employee not just looking at a web page or an employee handbook, but what are some of those unofficial texts that are out there? Can you even think of examples of texts that are shared? It may be email exchanged, for example, or it may be just some kind of understood book that people in the organization have shared in common because of some of the ideas that are in that book. So with that, what I've stressed all along is that while textual analysis may not be a primary method, it's going to be primary if you're looking at an organization that focuses on a written versus an oral communication style. So you determine text or credible text, and then you move to determining the kind of analysis. And as I mentioned earlier, we're going to talk about content, rhetorical, and critical linguistic. Content analysis is this notion of letting categories emerge from the elements. And that is, you're going to look at some feature of the text, determine a unit of measurement, and in that process, begin to determine what's important. So what's that look like? Well, any number of things could happen. I would encourage you, even now, if we were in class, to pick up one of the text that you identified. If you were engaged in content analysis, let's say your text is a newsletter, and you may decide that the unit of measurement, the focus you're going to give to your analysis is going to have to do simply with frequency of words and phrases. So you thumb through the newsletter and you decide, it seems like this particular phrase shows up, this other phrase shows up frequently as well, and you actually make that your unit of analysis. So it may have to do with a phrase related to customer service or employee satisfaction. What are those phrases? It becomes one way to gauge what's important. It may be that in reading those, then, you begin to get a sense of some of the elements. Who are heroes, for example, that may show up in that newsletter? Or statements, because of their frequency of use, suggest at least values that the organization is wanting others to be aware of. So looking for those repeated phrases. And in some cases, the text may involve images. So paying attention to images that are present or that are not present. So are there pictures, for example, of not just employees, but of customers? If customer service is part of the text, what are they doing with images as well? So you're trying to determine what can you learn about the organization from this text with content analysis and letting that emerge naturally.